My people, what President of Ghana, John Mahama, just did will go down in history as one of the bravest, boldest, and yes, most necessary moves we've seen from an African leader in a long time. In a moment where silence would have been easier, where diplomacy could have demanded distance, he chose solidarity. He stood up, he spoke out, and he did it not for political points, not for applause, but for the truth. In an op-ed published by The Guardian, the president of Ghana took aim directly at Donald Trump's reckless, racist claims of white genocide in South Africa. He defended a fellow African nation on the world stage. He reminded the world of our history and refused to let it be rewritten. And in doing so, he modeled what real Pan-African leadership looks like. Unapologetic, unbought, and yes, unafraid. Because when one of us is being gaslit at the White House, we all feel the heat. And Mahama said, not this time. Today on The Breakdown, we're unpacking the full message behind his powerful words, the history he invoked, and why this moment, the act of public defiance against U.S. narrative control, is bigger than South Africa. It's about all of us. We're going to break it down, but before we dive in, a big welcome to all of our new subscribers and members. I'm so glad you're here. And if you're watching and haven't joined us yet, please consider this your personal invitation. Because here at Pan-Genius TV, we're not just building a channel, but we're creating a global home for Black stories that are told with truth, with intention, and with power. And so if that speaks to you, and I hope it does, hit subscribe, tap the bell, drop a super thanks, and consider joining our membership community where we go beyond the headlines. All right, now let's get into it. So we're going to go through President Mahama's op-ed section by section. And you already know what time it is. We're going to break it all the way down. I want you to stay with me to the very end, because this isn't just about what he said. It's about the symbolism of what he did. And I really want to hear your thoughts on that, because this moment is bigger than politics. It's about leadership, legacy, and standing up when it matters most. Let's go. Mahama starts off. The meeting at the White House between Donald Trump and the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa was, at its heart, about the preservation of essential historical truths. The U.S. president's claims of white genocide conflict with the actual racial persecution and massacres that took place during the 2 centuries of colonization and nearly 50 years of apartheid in South Africa. So what he's telling us here is, no, this wasn't just about a meeting, right? This was about memory, about facts, about narrative, about who gets to tell the story and who gets erased from it. He continues, it is not enough to be affronted by these claims or to casually dismiss them as untruths. These statements are a clear example of how language can be leveraged to extend the effects of previous injustices. This mode of violence has long been used against indigenous Africans, and it cannot simply be met with silence. Not anymore. So Mahama is calling out the meeting for what it really was, a dangerous attempt to rewrite history. Trump's claim of so-called white genocide in South Africa didn't just offend the truth, it reversed it. Because let's be clear, it wasn't white South Africans who were massacred under apartheid. It was Black South Africans who were dispossessed, who were murdered, who were systematically excluded from land, capital, and power under nearly 2 centuries of colonization, followed by 5 decades of apartheid brutality. So when Trump stands on a global stage and claims white genocide, he's not just wrong, he's using language as a weapon that distorts justice, a weapon that extends the trauma of colonization into the present. And Mahama gives us the real warning. This isn't just misinformation, it's strategic disinformation. It's a continuation of the same colonial playbook. Flip the script, cast the oppressor as the victim, and silence the voices of those still fighting for repair. And Mahama says plainly, it cannot be met with silence, not anymore. Because silence is complicity. Let's continue. The Kenyan writer Mzee Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote, language conquest, unlike the military form, wherein the victor must subdue the whole population directly, is cheaper and more effective. Whew, let that sink in. Because that quote from the legendary Kenyan writer and anti-colonial thinker Ngugi wa Thiong'o is not just poetic, it's prophetic. See, colonialism didn't end when the last British or Dutch soldier left African soil. It just changed uniforms. The new battlefield? Language, narrative, media. The stories were told, and the stories were taught to believe. And here's the trick. You don't have to drop bombs when you can drop myths. You don't need to occupy land when you can occupy minds. When Trump claims white genocide, he's not just spreading a lie, he's seeding fear globally. He's reprogramming public perception to view the historically oppressed as the new threat. That's not just ignorance, that's ideological warfare. And as Ngugi warned, that kind of warfare is cheaper, more scalable, and often more damaging than tanks and guns. Because when a false narrative takes hold, when you distort history just enough, it reshapes policy, it shifts sympathy, it redirects power. And suddenly, the victims of systemic violence are being asked to prove their innocence, to justify their very presence, to rewrite their pain into something more palatable. Mahama is ringing the alarm. This isn't a semantic debate. It's a struggle for sovereignty. Because if we lose control of the narrative, we lose control of the future. Let's continue. African nations learned long ago that their fates are inextricably linked. When it comes to interactions with the world beyond our continent, we are each other's bellwether. In 1957, the year before my birth, Ghana became the first Black African country to free itself from colonialism. After the Union Jack had been lowered, our first Prime Minister, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, gave a speech in which he emphasized that our independence is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa. Shortly after that, in 1960, was the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa, which resulted in 69 deaths and more than 100 wounded. In Ghana, thousands of miles away, we marched, we protested, we gave cover and shelter. A similar solidarity existed in sovereign nations across the continent. Why? Because people who looked like us were being subjugated, treated as second-class citizens on their own ancestral land. We had fought our own versions of that same battle. Now let's pause here because that's loaded. When President Mahama says we are each other's bellwether, he's not just being poetic, he's naming a Pan-African truth. Because in Africa, and I often say this here on the show, no country struggles in isolation, and no victory is ever truly local. From Ghana's independence in 1957 to the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa just 3 years later, the thread of solidarity has always run deep. When Sharpeville happened, when 69 Black South Africans were gunned down for demanding their dignity, Ghanaians marched, they protested, they opened their homes, and they weren't alone. Across the continent, newly independent nations stood up, not just in sympathy, but in solidarity, because they understood something that still rings true today. Oppression anywhere on the continent is a threat to freedom everywhere on the continent. As Mahama reminds us, Kwame Nkrumah, on the very day Ghana gained independence, declared, Quote, our independence is meaningless unless it is linked with the total liberation of Africa. That's not just rhetoric, that's a mandate. And it's why today, when South Africa is being gaslit on the world stage, when its leadership is being pressured into concessions that undermine its own equity laws, the rest of the continent must not stay silent. Because the moment we start believing that our fates aren't connected, that's when we lose the very foundation Pan-Africanism was built on. Mahama continues, I was 17 in June 1976 when the South African Soweto uprising took place. The now iconic photo of a young man in Mbuyisa Makubo carrying the limp 12-year-old body of Hector Peterson, who had just been shot by the police, haunted me for years. It so deeply hurt me to think that I was free to dream of a future, as this child was making the ultimate sacrifice for the freedom and future of his people. Hundreds of children were killed in that protest alone. It is their blood and the blood of their forebears that nourishes the soul of South Africa. The racial persecution of Black South Africans was rooted in a system that was enshrined in law. It took worldwide participation through demonstrations, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions to end apartheid so that all South Africans, regardless of skin color, would be considered equal. Nevertheless, the effects of centuries-long oppression do not just disappear with the stroke of a pen, particularly when there has been no cogent plan of reparative justice. Let's pause. Mahama takes us to June 1976, when a 17-year-old Mahama, still full of dreams, was confronted with an image that would haunt a generation. That's the photo he's referring to. The body of 12-year-old Hector Peterson, carried by a grief-stricken teenager through the chaos of the Soweto uprising, after being shot by apartheid police for daring to speak his own language. That image wasn't just tragic, it was transformative, because it forced the world to look and reminded people like Mahama and millions more that freedom in one part of Africa meant little while children were dying in another. This wasn't some spontaneous outburst of violence. It was the predictable outcome of a system, a legally enshrined, violently enforced racial hierarchy that treated Black lives as expendable. And here's where Mahama hits hard again. Even after the laws were repealed, the damage didn't just vanish. Yes, apartheid officially ended, but the economic structures, the social inequalities, and unhealed wounds, they remained. Because, as he puts it, there has been no cogent plan for reparative justice, no reckoning, no redistribution, just the illusion of equality, while the foundations of injustice were quietly left intact. So when Trump now speaks of white genocide as if white South Africans are somehow the victims of modern day persecution, it's not just offensive. It's historically dishonest, inaccurate. And more dangerously, it risks re-legitimizing the very systems so many died to dismantle. He continues, despite making up less than 10% of the population, white South Africans control more than 70% of the nation's wealth. Even now, there are few places in South Africa where only Afrikaners are permitted to own property, live, and work. At the entrance to once such settlement, Kleinfontein, is an enormous bust of Hendrik Verwoerd, the former prime minister who is considered the architect of apartheid. Another separatist town, Orania, teaches only Afrikaans in its schools, has its own chamber of commerce, as well as its own currency, the Ora, that is used strictly within its borders. It has been reported that inside the Oranian Cultural History Museum, there is a bust of every apartheid-era president, except F.W. de Klerk, who initiated reforms that led to the repeal of apartheid laws. Both Clairefontaine and Orania are currently in existence, and they boast a peaceful lifestyle. Why had the America-bound Afrikaners not sought refuge in either of those places? Had the Black South Africans wanted to exact revenge on Afrikaners, surely they would have done so decades ago when the pain of their previous circumstances was still fresh in their minds. What, at this point, is there to be gained by viciously killing and persecuting people you'd long ago forgiven? Let's pause. Let's deal with the receipts, because President Mahama is not speaking in metaphors. He's pulling back the curtain on the undeniable economic reality in South Africa. Despite making up less than 10% of the population, white South Africans still control over 70% of the country's wealth. Make that make sense. And yet, it's this same minority group that's now being framed, as Trump puts it, as victims of white genocide. Mahama isn't having it. He points out the bitter irony. The people still holding the power are the ones crying persecution. And then he takes us to places most of the world doesn't even want to see. Places like Clairefontaine and Orania, real living reminders that apartheid's ideology never fully died. In Clairefontaine, only Afrikaners are allowed to own land, live, and work. Right at the entrance, a giant bust of Hendrik Verwoerd, the man who literally designed apartheid. And Orania, they've created their own world entirely. They teach only in Afrikaans. They have their own currency, the aura. And in their museum, a shrine of apartheid-era leaders, except for one who dared to undo the system. These places still exist. They boast of peace or autonomy and a preservation of culture. So Mahama rightly asks, if Afrikaners truly felt unsafe in South Africa, why haven't they simply relocated to Orania or Clairefontaine, places built to center their language, power, and history? The answer? Because this isn't about safety. It's about preserving dominance while playing the victim. And then Mahama hits us with the moral core of his argument. Had the Black South Africans wanted to exact revenge on Afrikaners, surely they would have done so decades ago. What at this point is there to be gained by viciously killing and persecuting people you've long ago forgiven? Exactly. What we're witnessing isn't a fear rooted in reality. It's a fear rooted in guilt. The guilt of a system that was never properly dismantled. And the fear that one day justice might actually come knocking. And let's be clear, Black South Africans didn't choose revenge. They chose reconciliation. And the fact that they're now being painted as the aggressors, that's not just revisionist history, it's psychological warfare. Mahama continues. According to the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, half of the population of South Africa is under 29, born after the apartheid era and presumably committed to building and uplifting the, quote, rainbow nation. For what reason would they suddenly begin a genocide against white people? Ramaphosa was blindsided by Trump with those unfounded accusations and the accompanying display of images that were misrepresented. In one image, pictures of burials were actually from Congo. Trump refused to listen as Ramaphosa insisted that his government did not have any official policies of discrimination. If you want to destroy a people, Archbishop Desmond Tutu once said, you destroy their memory, you destroy their history. Memory, however, is long. It courses through the veins of our children and their children. The terror of what we have experienced is stored at a cellular level. As long as these stories are told at home, in church, at the beauty and barbershops, in schools, in literature, music, and on the screen, then we, the sons and daughters of Africa, will continue to know what we've survived and who we are. So President Mahama closes with a reality check and a warning. He reminds us that half of South Africa's population is under 29. These are young people born after apartheid, raised in a new democracy, educated to believe in Mandela's dream of a rainbow nation. So let's ask the obvious question. Why would they, this new generation, suddenly decide to launch a genocide against white South Africans? They wouldn't, and they haven't. But facts don't matter when someone like Trump is determined to rewrite the narrative. Mahama says Ramaphosa was blindsided in that White House meeting. Trump came with misrepresented images, some reportedly from the Congo, and used them to accuse South Africa's black-led government of racial persecution. Gaslighting at the highest level. And while Ramaphosa tried to insist there was no such discriminatory policy, Trump wasn't interested in truth. He was only interested in spectacle. And then Mahama invokes Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said, if you want to destroy a people, you destroy their memory, you destroy their history. Because that's what this really is. A battle for memory. The memory of apartheid, of land stolen, bodies buried, dreams crushed under boots and laws. That memory lives not just in books, but in our bones. And as Mahama writes, as long as we keep telling those stories in our homes, in our schools, our music, our barbershops, our screens, then we, the sons and daughters of Africa, will not be erased. We will remember. And in remembering, we reclaim our power. Then he wraps up with this. Mzi Ngugi wa Thiong'o wrote, the process of knowing is simple. No matter where you want to journey, you start from where you are. We journey forward with a history that cannot be erased and will not be erased. Not while there are children dying in the mines of the Congo and rape is still being used as a weapon of war in Sudan. Our world is in real crisis. Real refugees are being turned away from the borders of the wealthiest nations. Real babies will die because international aid has been abruptly stopped. And real genocides are happening in real time all across the globe. Boom. There you have it. President Mahama closes with another powerful quote from Ngugi wa Thiong'o. The process of knowing is simple. No matter where you want to journey, you start from where you are. And where we are right now, my people, is in a world that's on fire. We're not dealing with theories or distractions. We're dealing with real suffering, real violence, real injustice. While Trump conjures up false narrative of white genocide, children are dying in Congo's mines, digging up the minerals that power your smartphones. Rape is being used as a weapon of war in Sudan, in conflicts the world refuses to look at. Refugees are being turned away from the gate of nations that built their wealth on stolen labor and stolen land. Babies will die, not metaphorically, literally, because international aid has been slashed overnight, and actual genocides are unfolding in real time with no viral outrage, no policy response, and no global empathy. So Mahama reminds us, this fight is not just about South Africa. It's about truth. It's about memory. It's about refusing to let manufactured outrage distract us from real pain. We move forward with a history that cannot and will not be erased. Not while we continue to speak. Not while we still tell the truth. Not while we still remember who we are and what we've survived. Because to forget is to surrender. Now I want to hear from you, my people. What do you think about President Mahama's powerful op-ed? Is this the kind of leadership, solidarity that Africa needs more of? And what does this mean for the future of Pan-African unity and global Black solidarity? Drop your thoughts in the comments because, as always, the conversation doesn't end here. Let's start breaking it down together. That's it for today's show. If this episode opened your eyes, don't just scroll past it. Hit that like button, subscribe, share this, and join our membership community where we go deeper beyond the headlines. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Sandra Babu-Boateng. Until next time, take care. Hey you! Thanks so much for watching this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, don't forget to subscribe and join the family. Also, visit face2faceafrica.com for your daily news and updates on what's going on within the global Black community so you can stay informed.